This video is part 2 of my organisational series of videos, in this case covering Russian infantry divisions and how they were structured during the war. I've created these videos in order to assist my efforts in creating army lists for a number of different micro-arm sets of rules. I found it's surprisingly difficult to get accurate information on this subject. Either I could obtain an accurate snapshot of formation, but could not obtain info on the changes which occurred, or there was a serious mismatch between formal organisation and actual organisation. Before I proceed any further, I wish to raise a quick caveat. My analysis of TONEs has been focused on creating army lists for micro-armour sets of rules. As a result, these would not meet the robust standards of historical analysis, so if your expectation is an in-depth, very accurate analysis of the structure of a division, this video may not actually be what you're looking for. The other point I wish to raise is my sources. In some cases I've obtained high quality official structures, in other cases unreliable TONE diagrams. The bulk of my information comes from the excellent Niehorster documents. In my case I use the source from Carl and the niehorster.org site. My other sources are too numerous to list, but they range from wargaming TONE books from the 1970s to Wiki. However, there are two specific sources I wanted to raise because I've used them extensively in this video. The first is Stephen J. Zaloga and Leland S. Ness's Red Army Handbook, which I can assure you is an excellent book on the Soviet Army. Anyone interested in this topic should purchase it. And of course, the Charles C. Sharp series of books on various divisions and corps within the Russian army. That source is an extremely good source if you want to know what all the divisions, or when the divisions were formed, when they were destroyed, how they were organised and what regiments, etc. were placed in them. Another excellent source, although that one's quite difficult to obtain. Finally, in my organisational analysis, I am not including transport, supply, signals and other administrative formations. My main focus is combat troops, although I must admit in an emergency, non-combat troops often found themselves in combat. And this was particularly something that occurred with the German army. Not sure about the Russian army. There is no way I'll be able to provide an accurate description of all the changes which occurred within the Russian Infantry Division, or Rifle Division, as there were a lot. The Russians issued official organisations on a regular basis. We will start with what I will call a TONE 4/20-38 Infantry Division. I'm uncertain what the numbers mean, but 38 is almost certainly the year when the structure was officially documented, specifically April 1938 in this case. This division was a whopper. It was large, lavishly equipped with complex equipment. It also failed miserably in Finland, although worked rather well against the Japanese. The standard reason given for why this division failed was the Russians' lack of the ability to have or to field large Western divisional structures due to skills. I personally feel the real reason was Stalin's purges, as what made this division fail in Finland but succeeded in Mongolia was experienced officers. I am uncertain how many divisions were equipped to this level. I have no doubt many lacked all the equipment, but on the other hand, the Russians did possess sufficient equipment to equip most of the divisions, so it's possible most of the frontline divisions were equipped to this level. The Rifle Regiment had a large support formation with companies of anti-tank guns, infantry guns, heavy mortars and quad Maxim AMGs. This is a rather large support formation and would allow the regiment an astounding level of independence. This was particularly useful, I suspect, in Mongolia. The infantry battalion was also well equipped, especially with anti-tank guns, which in the early war period was rare. A lot of new equipment was issued in 1937 and 1938, so I expect this structure was designed around these new weapon systems, or perhaps vice versa. The Russian infantry divisions consisted of two artillery regiments, one equipped with 76mm guns and 122mm howitzers, and the other with 122mm howitzers and 152mm howitzers. I wonder if some of the 122mm howitzers were actually 122mm guns, but regardless, the Germans noted how Russian counter-battery fire was unusually effective early in the war, that is in 1941, and the Russian guns, especially the 122mm, outranged the German 15cm howitzer. In summary, the Germans felt the Russian artillery was very good, particularly in 1941. The 76mm guns could and were used in an anti-tank role, although lacked the low profile of a proper anti-tank gun. This would have been mainly using long-range HE rounds, as occurred with the French 75mm guns. The early German tanks were susceptible to even HE rounds of this calibre. In terms of armour, the infantry divisions were well equipped, with 2 companies of light tanks and 1 company of light armoured cars. This division was capable of armoured attacks. On the other hand, in 1941, most of the equipment was in poor condition, so I expect the infantry division lacked the ability to maintain a lot of this armour. This could have also been a result of the purges, but putting aside that, this division could launch a decent armoured attack if the vehicles were working. The only thing missing was adequate motorised infantry, but it did have a single company of motorcycle troops and 2 horse-mounted companies, so even in this area it could probably support the tanks with infantry. With adequate leadership and doctrine, this division would have been extremely formidable. However, the Russians lacked both. The other supporting formations within the Rifle Division were reasonably standard, except for an unusually good anti-aircraft capability. After the war with Finland, the Russians implemented a new infantry divisional structure. The anti-aircraft battalion was beefed up, the light tank battalion was removed, but the reconnaissance battalion was beefed up. The regiment was also modified, with manpower reduced and a number of adjustments, but nothing major. The real lessons of the Finnish wars were not learned. Within the Rifle Regiment, the largest change was the reduction in size of the infantry company, from 234 men to 178 men. A minor change in the infantry battalion was a small increase in the number of 82mm mortars. The regimental support formation experienced a number of reductions in manpower changes, with some companies reducing in manpower, the cavalry platoon also being removed. But apart from these reasonably minor changes, there were no fundamental changes to address the real issues uncovered in Finland, which was a lack of experienced officers. There were no changes to the artillery regiments in April 1941. An interesting point, later in the war, a lot of Russian artillery was not really capable of on-demand artillery or fire support, or even counter-battery fire. However, it's highly likely that early in the war, the regiment, which was equipped with 152mm howitzers and 122mm howitzers, were probably designed to offer that kind of support. Whether or not there was adequate skilled artillery troops in order to provide it is another matter, but as I indicated before, the Germans did get some nasty surprises in 1941, particularly down in the south. Now, the other artillery regiment, equipped with the 76mm guns, probably lacked this ability, or it was certainly downplayed. The 76 was almost certainly used to a large extent in a direct fire role, which would require significantly reduced skill levels. However, I'm uncertain why there was a 122mm howitzer battery in this particular formation, if this was accurate. Perhaps it was still capable of providing long-range support, as it probably would not be that effective in direct fire. The Russian armoured and reconnaissance was totally reorganised, with the light tank battalion being removed and the new reconnaissance company possessing some armour. This was a sensible change and gave the infantry division quite an effective reconnaissance battalion. Concerning the other support battalions, there were no changes apart from the anti-aircraft battalion, which received an extra 37mm AA gun battery. I'm uncertain why this was the case. I can hardly imagine that the Russians suffered significant issues with Finnish aircraft, but nonetheless, perhaps they had the excess weapons in order to do this. Now we come to the post-invasion divisions. As you could well imagine, the Russian infantry divisions did not fare particularly well when the Germans invaded in June. As a result, the Russians needed to raise large numbers of emergency divisions, and the Russians, or Russian staff, created a new structure for their infantry divisions in July 1941, which really represented an emergency division and was called a diminished division. Obviously, it was designed to allow for lots of divisions to be created very quickly. This division structure had a dramatic reduction in heavy weapons at almost every level. It retained 3 infantry regiments, which each possessed 3 infantry battalions, but every other formation was dramatically reduced. The infantry were also poorly trained and almost certainly poorly equipped, and these divisions were quickly raised and in many cases quickly destroyed, but they did achieve their objective in delaying the Germans. At the infantry battalion level, the number of automatic weapons in the companies were reduced. The anti-tank guns were removed and the 82mm mortar reduced from 6 to 2. In terms of manpower, the infantry company was similar, but in terms of heavier weapons, this represented a major reduction. In many ways, this worked well, as the lack of experienced officers meant that they couldn't really handle dealing with lots of complex weapon systems. So this significantly simpler division, or battalion, actually matched the fact that they lacked the officers to man a normal battalion. At the regimental level, the regimental support level, the reduction in heavy weapons were not as severe, at least initially. The anti-tank guns and engineer companies remained the same. The mortar company strength was reduced from 4 weapons to 2, as was the infantry gun company, from 6 to 4 in that case. The anti-aircraft company was a surprise, with 6 37mm anti-aircraft guns being added. This may have been a result of the effectiveness of the German Air Force. The Russians lost its medium artillery regiment, but the light regiment gained an artillery battalion. Now, the medium regiment almost certainly contained the highest skilled artillery troops, the ones capable of providing direct fire support, counter-battery fire, etc. These obviously were being all pulled out of the infantry divisions, or simply they weren't available to equip the new divisions, to be centralised. For all practical purposes, the infantry division lost its indirect fire capability, with the 76mm guns being used mainly in a direct fire role. Once again, this was a reflection of the reality the Russians found themselves. Direct fire guns were simpler to operate than indirect fire artillery. Saying that, there were at least some 122mm howitzers, so it did retain some minimal ability for indirect fire, but I suspect this would have been mainly pre-planned. In terms of armour, or its reconnaissance battalion, it completely lost it, with only a token reconnaissance company remaining. As these divisions were mainly used in defence, this was a very sensible move. As for the rest of the supporting formations, the division lost a lot. The division lost its anti-tank battalion and chemical company. The engineer battalion lost its bridging column, for obvious reasons, but on the other hand, the anti-aircraft battalion remained unchanged, once again a reflection of the effectiveness of the German Luftwaffe. Once the immediate crisis was stabilised to a sort, the Russians continued to modify their rifle division structure to increase their effectiveness. The Russians decided to focus on anti-tank rifle companies as the main way to deal with German armour. And while this seems illogical, it did cause the Germans a great discomfort and was one reason why the Germans deployed armoured skirts on many of their armoured vehicles. Look, it made sense. Equipping an infantryman with an anti-tank rifle was a fairly simple weapon. You simply told them to fire at the big metal thing and they could do so. And if you had enough of it, maybe one of these little bullets actually ended up where it needed to knock out the tank or at least disable it. The Russians also decided on focusing on mortars and created a mortar battalion at the rifle regimental level, which pooled all the mortars, even the 50mm mortars, apart from a small section of 82mm mortars left in the rifle battalion. This was an interesting move. I'm not quite sure how logical it was, but it certainly beefed up its mortar indirect fire capability. Unfortunately, the regiment lost almost all its other supporting formations, such as AA Company, Engineers, AT Companies, regimental guns and heavy mortars. The 120mm mortars were now pooled into heavy mortar battalions, which were now added at divisional level. This provided a lot of the indirect fire capability which would otherwise be expected from the artillery regiment. At the rifle battalion level, the Russians added an anti-tank company, which was the first line of defence against tanks. This was equipped with anti-tank rifles. In 1941, few armies equipped their infantry with effective man-portable anti-tank weapons, but the Russians decided on the anti-tank rifle. Unlike the Germans and other armies which placed a few in each company, the Russians organised whole anti-tank rifle companies, although they were rather small companies by Western standards. The Germans instantly had a similar experience with their Panzerfausts, or Panzerschrecks, organising these weapons into company-sized formations as well, because they felt it was the most effective way of doing it. So this clearly must make sense. The biggest change at the regimental level was that it basically lost all its supporting formations except for a few AAMGs. To replace this loss, a mixed mortar battalion was added, equipped with 50 and 82mm mortars. It's possible when this occurred, all the mortars in the rifle battalion were also removed, but my sources indicate otherwise. This is rather an unusual structure, a whole battalion of mortars at a regimental level. Nonetheless, it almost certainly was required, considering that this division really did lack indirect fire capability. The artillery regiment remained unchanged. As for the supporting battalions of the Rifle Division, the main change was the addition of a 120mm mortar battalion. This gave the Rifle Division a much-needed boost in its indirect fire capacity. 120mm mortars were actually incredibly effective, and the Germans took note of this and decided to copy it for themselves. So by 1944 they were using them against the Western Allies, and the Western Allies were finding them extremely uncomfortable. One major advantage of 120mm mortars over, let's say, artillery providing indirect fire is, of course, air attack and also counter-battery fire. If you've got artillery battalions firing indirect over an extended period of time, that's a nice big target which aircraft can target. 120mm mortar can be hidden away more effectively in a dugout, thus protected against air power more effectively. This was also the case against counter-battery fire. It made a lot of sense. After Operation Typhoon, which basically represented another disaster for the Russians conducted another change. I suspect that removing so much regimental support formations was considered an error, and these were added back again with some modifications. The 82mm mortars were removed from the rifle battalions to be centralised into mortar battalions, the theory being the limited pool of skilled troops capable of using a weapon like a mortar were concentrated and thus less likely to be casualties in the rear position. I could just imagine the 82mm mortar crew, which were reasonably skilled troops in the battalion, being told to grab a rifle and man the trenches and as a result killed, which would have been a big loss to the Russians in terms of skills. The Russians also added a rocket artillery battalion to further beef up its indirect fire capability, as well as a motorised mortar battalion. The latter seems rather odd, and I strongly suspect was an error in my sources, but nonetheless I'm printing it as my sources tell me it existed. The anti-tank battalion was replaced, but the anti-aircraft battalions was replaced with a single company or battery. At the battalion level, the 82mm were removed. I'm assuming they were consolidated at the regimental levels. Again, the theory why this occurred was due to a lack of skilled staff to operate the mortars, and by concentrating them, it concentrated the skills and allowed new troops to quickly learn how to use these weapons. Anyway, the system did work quite effective. At the regimental level, the 76mm regimental guns and anti-tank guns were returned. I'm uncertain why they were removed in the first place, but clearly this was considered an error and they were brought back again. In addition, an anti-tank rifle company, an SMG company, was added at regimental level. The Russians decided that enough anti-tank rifles had a positive effect and equipped the rifle regiments lavishly with this weapon. I'm uncertain why an SMG company was added. This may have been added to act as a reserve for the regiment. The actual artillery regiment did not change. However, a rocket artillery battery was added, which did increase the indirect fire capability of the division, especially when it's attacking. Rocket artillery was not as effective in fire support, but this was something the Russians did rarely, if ever so it was not really a downside. On the other hand, it was extremely effective when launching a local attack. At the supporting troop level, there were a number of changes, the first being the replacement of the AA battalion with a single AA battery of 6 37mm AA guns. This must have been caused by a lack of these weapons rather than a reduction in the effect or the danger of the German Luftwaffe. The other change, which does puzzle me, was the addition of a motorised heavy mortar battalion. I'm uncertain how common this was and suspect this is an error in my sources or an ad hoc allocation from corps or army level, but nonetheless that's what the sources say, that's Niehorster, and that's what I've added. The anti-tank battery was returned to this as a support formation. I'm thinking the reason why the earlier division lost their anti-tank guns was to allow the creation of anti-tank brigades. Regardless, the guns were returned, and it's possible some of the newer 57mm anti-tank guns may have been allocated to the infantry divisions, although I must admit I doubt that this more effective weapon was provided to the infantry divisions, and it was almost certainly provided to higher value formations such as the tank corps, etc. The engineer battalion lost a company. The January 1942 rifle division structure did not remain unchanged for long. In March, a new structure was authorised. I should note the dates are all the official authorised dates. In some cases, the changes had already occurred. In others, they were yet to come. The motorised heavy mortar battalion is gone, assuming it was ever officially issued. As I said, I doubt that it was ever officially there. A mixed mortar battalion was added to the division, and actually I personally think this was probably added back in January instead of the motorised mortar battalion, and there was a typo somewhere. So these two changes may not actually be changes at all. Thus, the real change was the anti-aircraft battalion returned, and the anti-tank battalion started getting some anti-tank rifle troops as well as normal guns. At the battalion level, additional LMGs were added to the rifle companies, with some additional manpower modifications occurring for the supporting formations. This was a general trend of both armies, German and Russia. The manpower went down and the amount of automatic weapons went up. At the regimental support level, some minor manpower modifications occurred, specifically the regimental gun company. Otherwise, no real changes here. The artillery regiment and rocket battalion did not change, although I did note there was some reductions in manpower. Clearly the Russians were experiencing manpower issues, and they were probably scouring through every single formation they could find with unnecessary men that they could pull out to form new divisions or to replace casualties in existing divisions elsewhere. I've already mentioned this in a little bit of detail. The biggest change here was the motorised 120mm mortar battalion was replaced by a mixed mortar battalion. As indicated before, I suspect that the motorised mortar battalion was never actually there in the first place, and it was a mixed mortar battalion in the first place, and actually no real change occurred. The first real change apart from this was the addition of anti-tank rifle company to the anti-tank battalion. The final change was the return of the anti-aircraft battalion, with a battery strength increased to 8. So it went down to a company or a single battery, went back up to a battalion, but actually in terms of guns went up because the battery strength went from 6 to 8. Once again, acknowledgement of the effectiveness of the German Luftwaffe. After another 3 months, we get another major reorganisation. It should be pointed out a large number of minor changes would occur almost every month, possibly related to a battalion level or even a company level. So I'm only really covering the major changes, or when the accumulation of minor changes were large enough to represent a major change. This is another reason why it's hard to keep track of what's actually occurring with the infantry divisions. And if you think the infantry divisions or rifle divisions were difficult to track, you should look at the tank corps. While I'm not certain, I suspect a lot of changes only affected new divisions initially, and the old structure would remain in older divisions well after they were replaced. However, considering Russian infantry divisions tend to become exhausted very rapidly and only a cadre remained to be sent back to be reorganised, I suspect that the old structure didn't remain in the field for very long. The change in July was significant as the 2nd Artillery Regiment returned, although not with a corresponding major increase in the number of guns. The other change was the addition of an anti-tank battalion and the removal of the mixed mortar battalion. At the battalion level, the general trend of company strength being reduced, although the number of automatic weapons increased, continued. The battalion also gained a mortar company and an SMG company, with the anti-tank rifle company losing some rifles but gaining some 45mm anti-tank guns instead. At the regimental level, the mixed mortar battalion was replaced with a single 120mm mortar company, which actually made a lot more sense. My guess is the change was a result of the division going back to a more normal structure. The artillery regiment gained a battalion, but the rocket artillery battalion was now lost. The anti-tank battalion disappears. Instead, you get a mixed heavy weapons battalion, which has within it anti-tank guns, rifles and MMGs. The anti-aircraft battalion was also removed and replaced with a company. Once again, I am uncertain if this represented a real change, but simply an aberration of the previous organisation. Because if you remember carefully, 2 organisation changes ago, the battalion was gone, replaced with a company. Then the battalion came back again, and now it's back to its original strength. So I'm really uncertain if this represented a real change or, once again, another example of older structures getting mixed up with new structures. In either December 1942 or January 1943, the Russians issued yet another new organisational structure. Most of the changes were reasonably minor. What we could possibly say at this point is the Rifle Division was finally beginning to stabilise into an optimal structure. At the battalion level, the company strength continued to reduce, which included, in this case, the support formations. The number of MMGs was reduced, but the number of 82mm mortars was increased. The biggest change was the removal of the 45mm anti-tank guns. There were no changes to the artillery regiment in this reorganisation. The MG battalion lost its 45mm anti-tank guns, although I'm not quite sure why these guns were in that formation in the first place. I'm really uncertain if they ever actually existed and may have actually been a vestige of the old anti-tank battalion. Otherwise, no changes. It's interesting to note that a lot of 45mm anti-tank guns were removed from the infantry or rifle divisions, so I assume these were being used to create anti-tank brigades. The next major change occurred in August 1943, which is quite interesting because this is probably the biggest gap that we've experienced so far during the war period, another indication that the Rifle Division was beginning to stabilise. The changes, even in this case, were quite minor and in some cases reversed the previous January 1943 changes, which makes me think that possibly some of those January 1943 changes may have been ad hoc or not very common. At the battalion level, the company strength continued to reduce, in this case to 107 men, which makes it a very small company. The number of LMGs and HMGs went up, so there was a significant increase in automatic weapons, so the firepower probably remained much the same. At the support level, the 45mm anti-tank guns were back. Whenever something like this occurs, which is a reverse of an early change, I always wonder if the early change ever happened. In this case, I suspect it had, so it represents a correction of a bad idea. The other theory is that they decided to create a bunch of ad hoc anti-tank brigades and decided to strip the infantry divisions because they were preparing for the Battle of Kursk. Once Kursk was won by the Soviets, the anti-tank guns went back to the infantry division. It seems like a reasonable theory. While the artillery regiment basic structure remained the same in terms of guns, the number of men manning this continued to go down. This is a general trend with many Soviet formations. They were clearly beginning to run out of manpower and needed to strip all the formations they could for excess men to be placed into new formations or to replace losses. In terms of supporting formations, the MG battalion was gone. I suspect its equipment was distributed back into the rifle regiments / battalions. The anti-tank battalion did not change, although it may have received new equipment by now. There were 2 versions of the 57mm anti-tank gun, and by August 1943, the ZIS-3 76mm anti-tank gun was being issued, although I suspect the newer weapons were reserved for the tank and mech corps, as well as the Guards rifle divisions. Incidentally, I am not covering the Guards formations in this video. The AA company / battery was gone, but by August 1943 the Russians were able to meet the Luftwaffe on a more equal level, so I suspect all these were now being consolidated at corps or at army level to be distributed as needed, which is fairly typical of most other formations in the West and also for the Germans. From this point on, we don't really see any major changes. They're all just basically tweaks. The Russians had pretty much achieved their optimal structure, and apart from these tweaks and new equipment, basically decided to run with it until virtually the end of the war. They did issue some new changes in August 1944, which was mainly focused on equipment. Almost certainly more ZIS-3s, anti-tank guns, were being issued to the anti-tank battalions at this point in time. In December 1944, the Russian headquarters, or Stavka, issued a new organisation change, which was reasonably major. I'm uncertain how many divisions were organised like this before the end of the war, as the burning out of Russian rifle divisions was not as common, so creating this style of division would have required pulling a functional division out of the front line in order to reorganise it. But I assume by May 1945 there must have been a number of these divisions in the front line. The biggest change was the addition of a rocket artillery regiment and an anti-aircraft battalion. Not quite sure why the anti-aircraft battalion was re-added after being removed in 1943, but perhaps the Russians had so much equipment, why not? The other area to look at is what kind of attached formations were commonly allocated to the rifle divisions. I'm actually uncertain if this occurred particularly much or on any kind of regular basis. Based on the sources, I have not seen much attached formations to rifle divisions, and where I have seen attached formations, such as heavy mortar battalions or possibly anti-aircraft battalions, they were only there for a very short period of time. As a result, unlike many other armies, it looks like the attached formations, if they were attached, were only there for a very specific period and a short time. While this video is not focused on formations below company level, the structure of the 1941 infantry company is included for completeness. Also for completeness, I've included the various support companies or platoons of the 1941 Russian battalion. This video is mainly based on research which was designed to create army lists for micro-armor rules, which used a platoon to company per element scale. As a result, it's not focused on the low-level structure of any formations, which would be the case if designed for skirmish or squad scale rules. At platoon, and more so at company scales, it's almost impossible to field accurate formations as single elements. Instead, a battalion is selected, all the manpower and weapons totaled, and then divided by the required divisor, perhaps 5 for tanks and guns and 50 for manpower. As a result, it's an accurate battalion, but below that point the elements do not represent any specific formations. At company scale, this is done at a regimental level. The result is the battalions or regiments are historically accurate, giving a player the required level of a national difference to make the game more interesting and less a chess-like board game. For skirmish or squad scale rules, the focus needs to go down the organisational hierarchy, which is not being attempted in this video. This completes my rather long video on this subject. I have no doubt I shall be updating this video in the future as I obtain new source material. I have posted some of the source material used in the URL shown in this image. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heil, Heimatland zu kämpfen.